FAA, Veterans Affairs, Interior, I believe, and Treasury. Did I get that right? Okay. And one of the benefits of these franchise funds is that you're able to, number one, keep 4% of your revenues each year to use for various purposes, including improvements. But even more importantly is that they allow you to keep an operating reserve. So that's where you can do your modernizations that you need to scale up if you're going to be selling to other agencies or even within your own agency. And then one of the interesting discussion topics of the last panel we just completed was that the discussion was, well, do you really need to have your own funding, or can you simply just lease or get a shared service provider from another agency rather than, say, modernize and do all the expensive things you need to do to keep up? You just outsource, essentially. You get a shared service provider and you pay a fee to that shared service provider. So those comments might serve as a spark for some of your questions. But let me start with the panelists and have them do their 3 minutes. David, you want to start?
Sure. So like I said, I'm David Copenhaver. I'm Deputy Chief Counsel for Bureau of Fiscal Service. I am the oddball in the group, but probably in the room, since I'm hopefully the only lawyer. And if I am the only lawyer, then I can speak freely. I've got a 16-year-old son who's a junior in high school, and he's taking some English comp at the local university, and he tells me that everything has to have a title. So I've got a title for my little 3 minutes, and it's Lawyers, we put the fun in funding challenges. Because we do our best. And when you're talking about funding and you're moving funding between agencies, it's appropriated dollars, and anytime you move appropriations, you've got to have counsel. They've got to be able to understand the statutory authority. They've got to be able to draft that authority, modify that authority. Really importantly, they've got to believe that authority. If you've got authority and your attorney doesn't believe that it does what you think it does, then you don't have that authority, right? Because you've got to have somebody that's going to defend that to customer agencies, to GAO, OMB, and they've got to be able to communicate that authority clearly to customer agencies and everybody else. So from a shared service perspective, if you're the SSP, your counsel, to have effective counsel, you've got to be able to draft or change the authorities to fit the business model, which means you've got to do a little creative thinking. We've talked about franchise funds, we've talked about working capital funds, and what are some of the flexibilities that are provided under each. You've got to have an attorney that understands that. You've got to have dedicated counsel that knows and can argue for that authority. And you've got to have somebody that can educate, not really opposing counsel, customer agency counsel. You've got to have somebody that can educate program staff on what the statutory authority says, talk to OMB and GAO. If you're the service recipient, you've got to be able to have counsel that's willing to take the time to understand that provider's authority and their own authority, right? Because as a shared service recipient, you have needs, you have things that have to get accomplished, and you've got to be able to express those through your counsel to the shared service provider counsel. You've got to have counsel that has a clear understanding of the roles. If there's a shared service recipient and they've got a specific limitation on appropriation, I'm not going to opine on that, right? That's your money. You guys are going to render the opinion. But we all need to collaborate and work together. And to do that best, you've got to get your counsel involved early. At the foundation of when you're going to start to provide the shared service or when you're going to think about getting shared service. And I think what was pointed out before was not just counsel, but all aspects of your team. But since I'm the attorney, I'm going to have a passive start. And then if you're the shared service recipient, you also need counsel that's willing to turn over a little bit of control. If, for example, in a procurement arena, you're going to go to a shared service provider, you're going to come to my client to do your procurement work, then if there's a protest, I'm going to handle that. If there's a claim, I'm going to handle that. We're going to work together, we're going to collaborate, we're going to get all the issues out and discuss them, but you've got to be able to turn over a little bit of that control and be comfortable with that. So get your attorneys into the process early on, and I would say, especially since there's no attorneys in the room other than me, manage your attorneys, right? You need to manage your legal counsel because you need to make sure that legal counsel has the knowledge, skills, and abilities to help you through this process. And the last one, we heard some different agencies that kind of trip over things and have hiccups in the process and get slowed down. And if that's because your council doesn't know about the shared service stuff, that's a problem, and that needs to be managed.
Mike?
USDA in the payroll center, the National Finance Center, has been in the shared service business since the early 80s. So they're a very practical example of how shared service and moving the funding around works. They're a little different. They're not a franchise fund, but they still manage to service 170 orgs. And how many of you are feds? You asked the question, so I'm stealing it.
Go ahead.
How many of you get paid by the National Finance Center? Okay, about half of you raise your hands. That's about the rough market shares, maybe half, a little more. They've been doing that since, before I got there, in the mid-'80s now. They're providing services under the Economy Act, so income has to equal expenses, but like a franchise fund in the appropriations law, the annual law, they can retain 4% for capital improvements to help smooth the funding out or to handle extraordinary, unexpected expenses like a mandatory evacuation of New Orleans in the event of a hurricane. So it works. You can move the money back and forth that way. I won't say a franchise fund and the formal reserve couldn't help, but it will work. You talked about getting legal counsel involved early. With the shared service providers, the other people to get involved early is your budget execution team, your CFO group, not the people who help formulate the budget, but the people who actually have to keep track of your money, because they're going to be on the signature lines on your interagency agreements. And it is part of getting that whole team together. If they don't know in advance that how you're going to spend the money, where it's coming from, how to describe it, how to move it back and forth through IPAC and Treasury, it's not going to work really well. You're not going to get the services when you needed to get them.
Very good, thanks. Tom?
Department of Education does not have a franchise fund, does not have a working capital fund, and do a limited number of activities for other agencies. But in thinking some about the challenges for shared services, the kinds of things we get from other agencies. We get our payroll function from Interior, not from the National Finance Center, but same kind of thing. It's a
We could do a better job. No, I'm sorry.
Healthy competition.
Sorry.
They're cheaper there, but no, they're not. It's about the same kind of function. But
No comment.
you do have to look at the kinds of things that you do as an organization, and you have to decide, should you hire people to do it? Should you have a contract to do it? Can you get an interagency agreement where somebody else's contractor can do it or employees can do it for you? There's advantages and disadvantages to each. There's advantages to having it done by all your employees. Maybe you get maximum control over that. You know what's being done. On the other hand, you're at maximum vulnerability because those people can leave on you. You've got to identify the people, hire them, nurture them, and all that. So there oftentimes are those decisions. Might do it yourself or buy it from somebody else, make or buy. And shared services can work. Big challenge, too, to shared services. One is getting enough money, which is, again, a challenge if you're going to hire people or do a contract or anything else. Just getting adequate funds for it. Another is just all the paperwork that's involved. How do you make it happen? Things like franchise funds and working capital funds are set up to make it a little bit easier for the recipient agency to get the money. If you're still working with them through a memorandum of understanding or an interagency agreement, it can cause a lot of paperwork for you. It's just, again, it's a challenge. Contracts are also a challenge. Hiring people through the civil service system is a challenge. There's always going to be challenges, and you hope that shared services will minimize those and make it a little bit easier for you to do your work in the most efficient way possible. So it's a good thing to do. Again, there are lots of challenges, legal, administrative, financial, to getting it done, but certainly it's generally a good idea.
Ron?
Okay, I'm Ron Thompson. I'm with the Department of Health and Human Services. My organization used to be part of the Program Support Center, and you're going to hear from Paul Bartley in a few minutes here, and he'll tell you about what all that is. But that's really a fee-for-service part of HHS that does business outside of our department. My focus has been taking IT that the PSC used to offer and bring it inside and focus internally with our internal service delivery. So that's sort of my role. You know, looking at this idea of shared services and when to use it, I think a lot of agencies are really struggling with the inability to move their capital investments. You know, and typically it really focuses on real estate or actually building projects, you know, physical building space. So that's where, you know, we're seeing that really need for shared services. It sort of smooths out the IT spend a little bit over the fiscal years, gives us the ability to ramp up a lot quicker. You know, we'll probably be in a CR again this year, and we can't spend until that CR is actually turned into appropriation law and spend new dollars into anything. So we're sort of hamstrung from a federal perspective on how we buy our goods and services. So you know, our role is actually a service provider role. So that's a little bit unique compared to these gentlemen on the panel right now. But we'll get into talk a little bit, Chuck, about talking about benefits and where different struggles and opportunities are really affecting other people in a bit.
Okay. So you've heard from our 4 panelists. I'd like to ask a question to the folks in the audience. A bunch of hands went up, but how many of the government people are shared service providers or are trying to be shared service providers? Well, a good half of you guys. Yeah. So let me ask you folks that are the government shared service providers, how easy or hard is it for you to transfer money between bureaus within your agency or between your agency and other agencies? Is it easy, hard? Does it take a long amount of time, a short amount of time? Any of those who just raised their hands? Yes, sir.
I think like David said, the very beginning stage of the IAA agreement, getting agencies to sign on to that IAA agreement for that 12-month period of performance was the hardest part we had, the Treasury, dealing with our customers.
So how long does it take you to get that IAA?
August 1st. We're going to have that by 9:30. And we've only got about half of them right now. So we're still waiting half of us to sign an IAA before 2 weeks.
Is it going to be money exchanged as well, or just an agreement?
It's an agreement. It's the IAA form. So it's the obligation of funds.
Oh, it is an obligation.
Obligation of funds 12 months, yes.
Okay. And so you've never done it before, though? This is the first time?
What do you mean?
In other words, the first time you've done the IAA?
Yeah, we did it last year as well.
Did it take 2 months last year?
Longer last year.
Took longer. So it took, what, 5 months last year?
So we had people signing, customers signing as well as in the January, February timeframe.
So you started in February and you finished by September?
No, we started in the August timeframe of last year.
Okay.
Before the end of fiscal year 14.
Right.
And people, customers signed on as far as January, February of FY 14.
So it took 6, 7 months.
Do you think part of that delay was because Congress didn't give you an appropriation until January? Or didn't give the other agencies their money until January?
Hammering out the services being provided to that customer, between our program offices and the customer itself. Getting their legal support to buy into a shared service to a privilege franchise fund.
So are you at Treasury, you said? So, you know, when you think of Treasury, you say, okay, franchise fund should be boom, 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 it's done. So why was it so slow?
Well, for us, we transferred all of our capital funds for programs into the Treasury franchise fund.
Right.
It's a big cultural change.
Right.
For people who dealt with WCF, figure out TFF. Whereas we have ARC, and ARC has a pretty smooth process with their customers on the IAA.
So I will say, ARC from a,
Yeah, but the IA has nothing to do with the transferring of the money at that stage. The IA is an upfront agreement on what's being bought and what's being provided.
Right.
And you what type of fund you use to transfer the money once it's signed.
Right, you need an IPAC to go with the IAA.
I think the length of time, though, had nothing to do with it being a franchise fund or a capital fund. The length of time was just what he's calling out, is the length of time it takes before they decide what they want.
Yeah,
Seal
I
the
mean,
deal.
it does and it doesn't, though. I mean, my point is that if you're using Economy Act authority, it tends to take a long time to get that paperwork done. Whereas if you have a franchise fund, generally it's like a little machine. They're used to cranking this stuff out. They've got, you know, staff there who do just this, and it's very efficient, I would say. Would you agree with that? Or
So this is actually a pretty good dichotomy, even within Treasury's franchise fund. So we've got Michael in the back there that works for ARC.
what does ARC stand for?
Administrative Resource Center.
Okay.
It operates within Treasury's franchise fund and provides about 5 shared services: information technology, administrative services, procurement, the financial management stuff. So, but you guys start your pricing April-ish?
Yeah, it's pricing usually starts in the spring, and we send our agreements out anywhere between April and May timeframe, but yeah, it takes until September to get signed, usually after.
But Treasury through ARC has been doing this for at least 15, 16 years. So we've kind of tripped over things, and we've gotten to the point where its working capital fund got transitioned over to Treasury Franchise Fund. This is your second year in the fund, right? So
First year at 514, 15 of those.
it'll be your second year. So even with a mature franchise fund, it takes a little bit to get that. There's a learning curve.
Sure.
You know, it takes you a little bit to get to the point where you're issuing those things. But even in a mature organization like ARC, you're still talking 6-7 months for the interagency aspect of it, not necessarily the transfer of funds.
Yeah, moving the actual money's
Yeah.
mechanics, but
Yeah.
even the National Finance Center, they do their pricing in the springtime, and then it just takes a while. A lot of times people have other priorities in the fourth quarter of the fiscal year, and then it's like, oh yeah, I need to get that signed if I want to get paid.
Right. Okay, let's hear from one of the other folks who raised their hand. Yes, sir.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Catherine Withdrawal. Our situation is somewhat different. 2 years ago, we were forced to actually, I would say, federate some of our services. with
Which agency are you with?
Our Department of Justice.
Okay.
Office of Justice Programs. We're one of the 3 grant-making entities within the Department of Justice. And based on a jail finding, we had to actually share some of our services. I think we're successful with that. And my biggest fear is that some rather industrial feds are going to say, now we start charging for those services. So I'm just here to figure out exactly what I need to know so I can get out of that, personally myself. But do provide the right folks in my organization with the knowledge so they can be in the charge, because that's next.
I mean, how do you get out of paying for those services? And these are services provided by which office?
Okay, 3 offices, A, B, and C.
Okay.
I'm A. We're sharing, I would say, 3 applications, 3 or 4 or 5 applications, all together with 2 other entities. They're not paying for those services now. And this was done based on a GL finding. GL suggested that we do this, so we comply.
That they charge a fee.
Not charge a fee, that we share the services.
Oh, that you share.
My fear is the next step will be that someone in my organization will say, let's begin to make money off this.
Well, and there's no making money, but there's the avoiding, augmenting, and appropriation and having an Anti-Deficiency Act
To
violation.
them, it's making money.
Now,
Well,
if you make money, that's an Anti-Deficiency Act violation.
Right. So it depends on the authority under which you're providing the service to another organization. And typically that lays out how much you can charge, what you can use that money for. But like Mike says, if you're receiving a benefit but you're not paying for that benefit, you may want to chat with counsel, because there's very strict rules about appropriations and the ability to augment those appropriations with somebody else's labor.
And that's my fear, that the next step is, okay, how can we start charging for these services that we provide?
Well, where income equals expense under the Economy Act, you're fine.
Right.
If somebody's trying to make money off of it to augment and do other things, yeah, you need to talk to counsel like tomorrow, if they're not in this afternoon.
And the 2 things will be, what's the authority? What's the interagency authority to do the work? And what's the interagency authority to do the invoicing? What's the income versus expense offset?
In fact, I'll have a conversation with general counsel this week.
Yeah, I mean, that's when you can go to jail over.
Highly recommend that, yeah.
At education, we don't have a working capital fund or franchise fund, which can charge up to 4% sort of for cost of service. But for every incoming interagency agreement, we get dozens of them, we charge 1% administrative fee, because there is work involved in processing that. Your lawyer's cost, contract costs, all kinds of things you're incurring those costs, and there's no reason why, say, the Department of Education should pay for the sake of a Justice Department grant that you're basically making through us. So, but that's fairly minimal, and we don't do as much of it as some of the bigger agencies.
And then even then, it's still income is about expense,
Yeah.
you know, roughly.
De minimis, they call it. That's the word.
Okay, how about one of the other people who raised their hands earlier? Go ahead. That gentleman in the back?
Not on this topic, I can another topic, if that's okay.
Well, I just want to continue on this vein because it's educational. Yes, sir.
State Department, we have a specific working capital fund authority, 20 years experience, similar, to prepare our cost invoices in the spring or so, get the money. It becomes routinized. If you're over, you have to sign up for the services. It's an international cooperative administrative support services. So it's the overseas platform and commissions around the world. But very similar. It's not franchise fund, it's working capital fund money, but it's a specific authority.
But it's pretty quick. I mean,
It's routinized.
so
There's drivers, or you build systems that drive, all the metrics.
it's electronic, partly.
Mostly.
Mostly is good.
EPA has a.
It's not free, but it's scrutinized. They drive, the invoices come out, but people gotta collect all the metrics. How many vehicles are in country, how many guards, how many people, how much floor space an agency takes in a mission, what was the electric bill, all the costs. They all drive in, divide, how many, education, if you're overseas, gets a bill, HHS gets a bill, Treasury gets a bill, state pays most of it, most of the costs, about 70% of the costs are state, but all the agencies, 40-some share.
I was going to mention EPA has a electronic system. It's a catalog that's online, and any time of the day or night you can go on there and select the shared service that you want and pay for it through their it's called a word capital fund, but it's really a franchise fund. So I just think that's terrific, but I don't know if anybody else is familiar with it. Probably not. Anyway, something to think about. These electronic catalogs of shared services where you can actually select them and purchase them seems like a way to go going down the road.
They do that somewhat, but some of them are hard. You can't. You price the use of a motor pool. You have to buy the cars. There's some capitalization that has to occur.
Right.
And then you divide the number of uses, and that's next year's invoice. There's sort of a rolling cost structure to it. And within a post, there's pages where you can order, hey, something broke at a residence, something broke at a building, different things. But it's all driven by local councils. It's transparent as hell. All the local councils decide how many people are in which pools and which things.
It is interesting, though, that it's a working capital fund, and yet you're selling to other agencies. Do you know the authority by which it is selling to other agencies?
I could get it to you. It's not what I do, but I can get it to you.
Yeah.
It was passed in about 1995, 96.
Yeah.
Foreign Agriculture Service, I know, pays you guys.
FAST or customers, foreign commercial service, DOD, anybody that uses the services overseas. So,
Okay.
payroll services, HR services, motor pool, security,
Yeah.
travel. There's a whole listing of services out on websites, and then the agencies approve the overall budget, and that becomes the invoices that drive everything.
Okay. I saw a hand go up in the back there. Go ahead, ma'am.
I wanted to follow up on what you said about the EPA service catalog. Is that available outside of the EPA or just internally?
No, I think it's available outside the EPA too, yeah. Forgot the name of it. Let me think. It's called E-something. E-catalog, I think. Go to the EPA website and just type in catalog or something like that, and maybe that's where you could find it. But I would love to see that kind of thing replicated. It seems pretty efficient, and it's tied to the working capital fund. So if you don't find it directly, you could get it from the working capital fund people there.
I had a different question.
So the motor pool example is a pretty interesting one that you can use to maybe tease out the difference between working capital funds and franchise funds in general. And I don't know how much folks know about the difference between the two, but working capital fund generally allows an entity, a fund, to provide services within that department. They can provide services outside the department, but they're going to do it under the Economy Act, and that's actual expense, on a year-to-year basis. For the franchise funds, you've got the ability to charge an operating reserve and retained earnings, and customer agencies look at that often and say, well, you're just charging me more money. But one of the benefits is, for example, in the motor pool scenario, eventually you're going to have to buy a car, right? And so if you're in an actual cost kind of a scenario, the year that you have to buy a car, that cost of that car has got to be reflected in that agreement, right? And so, your customer agencies in the year that you bought that car are like, why did my agreement go up by X number of dollars? And your explanation is, well, we bought cars and this is how it's going to be. But for the franchise funds, they've got this operating reserve and this retained earnings where they can accumulate a little bit of capital. You pay a little bit more year over year, but when they go to buy a car, it doesn't end up with this spike in your bill that doesn't, you're not into that explanation. So it does a couple of things. Number one, it smooths out, I think, the capital acquisition process, but also it smooths out your budget as a service recipient. So instead of trying to budget for when the cars are going to be purchased, or when the IT assets are going to be purchased, or when the building is going to be built, or whatever the service being provided is, you've got this more smooth. You generally know how much this is going to go up. You don't have to worry about going out and making the acquisition of the car because it's going to be done by the service provider. So those are some key benefits to franchise fund versus working capital fund, in the shared service space.
Thank you. Go ahead.
And I'm with the Program Support Center, so we operate under a working capital fund also, and it's kind of a hybrid of what you just talked about, because we have a small percentage of retained earnings that we have associated with the charter of this working capital fund. So we offer services within this Department of Health and Human Services as well as outside.
Yes, good program. Congratulations. Seriously, I'm not just being facetious. It's a good program. There was one other hand I saw in the back. You can change the subject too. You don't have to stay on the same subject. Go ahead.
So, I get that you can charge a little bit more, but what happens when the expense is really large? And in another forum, a CFO made the comment that if you look at payroll, there's been no modernization of any of the payroll providers since people have gone over there. And it's probably going to be a pretty monstrous cost to upgrade any one of them. How do you propose that gets funded? Because I doubt it's in there. That it's already built into their fees.
Well, I can't say there's been no modernization. They haven't changed the core. They haven't switched to an ERP system. A lot of it has been working around the edges with the TNA system, or what's that one? That starts the HR process and the hiring. The 4% fee, you're right, it doesn't cut it. You can't absorb all your expenses there. So organizations like ours have to plan on a certain level of expense in modernization each and every year, find ways to squeeze and make things more efficient, whether it's consolidating tools or whatever, to make the dollar stretch further. And then that 4% that's invested, that's to handle the fluctuation in what you expense in modernizing every year. To do a wholesale, hey, we're going to drop everything and do a $100 million modernization, no, you can't do that in 4%. You're right.
So how do you propose that's going to happen? Because, what I'm hearing is everybody saying, well, this, that's the model, this is what's going to happen with the financial shared service providers and other shared service providers. So, I thought this was a discussion on solutions. So.
Well, I was waiting for you to finish before I answered. So the two things that we've talked about, what's your name?
Carlos.
Carlos? You're with a government agency? Okay. Okay. So the two things that we've talked about over the last 2 hours, one is you get a shared service provider to provide it, and you become a leaseor of the service, okay? And that smooths out the payments, and instead of $100 million, maybe it's $500,000 a month or something. Two is the franchise fund. If the agency has one, then they keep a operating reserve available for exactly this kind of thing, for the upgrade of technology. That's one of the reasons why I'm very bullish about these franchise funds, is they enable you to modernize your technology so that I worked at NASA for about a year in their CIO shop, and there were several modernizations they just didn't have the money to do. I mean, they're getting cut 5-10% every year. They didn't have money to modernize. They just didn't. And some of those programs they had to end. So I think it's a real tragedy for some of these services that are, important for an agency to function properly and efficiently. So, these franchise funds have a real role, and so does the lease agreement. And Paul Bartley will tell you very proudly about his the lease agreements he has with service providers to provide services that he doesn't want to provide for whatever reason. Either he doesn't have the money, or he thinks they can do it better, or whatever. So those are two solutions, and I'm open to anyone else addressing. I mean, there have been proposals to allow the creation of an innovation fund. NASA looked into that. Congress didn't give them the money for that. So, but does anybody else have any suggested answers to this gentleman's question?
Well, I would add that even in the franchise fund scenario, if you've got a $100 million modernization, that's going to be a problem for even the franchise fund, right? Because most of the franchise funds are authorized to invoice other federal agencies for services provided to recover all their expenses of operation, including a reasonable operating reserve. Well, how do you define that, right? So if I've got one customer that leaves on average, on an annual basis, and I've got a little bit of business cycle, is $5 million enough? Is $10 million? Do I have to have $1 billion sitting in this operating reserve? That the Congress isn't going to be very happy about that, I would imagine. And you put $1 billion into a fund, and that department's going to be drooling over that money, to go do something else. So I don't know that it's necessarily going to solve, using a franchise fund, but it certainly does get you in a position where you can spend maybe a little bit more on an annual basis to do those modernizations. But if you get to the point where you got to replace your entire system, I mean, there's going to be impact for you and the customer agencies. But consider, if you had your own system and you were replacing it yourself, right? You'd be shouldering that entire burden, as opposed to, for example, ARC has 74 customer agencies, 40 some odd that are in the shared service environment. The R12 upgrade was shouldered by all of those folks, as opposed to everybody paying for their own upgrades.
It is a real dilemma, and I think that's why agencies are sometimes reluctant to get into these agreements. We did grants.gov with HHS 5-6 years ago, and agencies were supposed to contribute to that effort to pay for grants.gov. And grants.gov came up about the time of the Recovery Act, and it just collapsed. It couldn't do it. So agencies were told, well, one, we need more money at grants.gov to fix it and make it work. But at the same time, you also have to spend more money on your own system that was going to be the legacy that you're trying to get rid of. So you had almost 3 times the expense for an activity that you thought you were getting cheaper by going through the enterprise fund, the franchise fund. It doesn't always work. So my point has always been that the key problem is not how you move the money around, because we've got lots of authorities to do that through the Economy Act, interagency agreements, transfers, all sorts of things. The problem is getting enough money from Congress and making a convincing case to the appropriations committees that this is something worth doing, that there are not just long-term benefits from getting your payroll back faster, but that somebody's going to pay a lot less in the future, so that if they put in $100 million in somebody's appropriation, education or GSA, or that somehow they're going to get the money back. Over time, we haven't seen a lot of that. We don't see the savings, or the appropriators, let's say, don't see it in amounts that they can reduce in the next year or the year after. And it just gets worse when you have things like sequesters that make budget and financial people even more nervous about making a long-term commitment. They'd rather be in a position of saying, well, hold it, I'm just going to scuttle that whole thing this year. The contract that I have says it's contingent upon the availability of funds, and we don't have funds, so we're not going to fund it. Instead of getting the word from another agency that says, hold it, no, you committed to this, we've got to have your funds, and we've got to have your 4% or the new 10% administrative fee we're going to charge in order to make these investments. So it's, again, there are challenges that are unique to doing shared services, but the more fundamental challenge is just getting sufficient funds out of Congress for what they consider administrative services that don't necessarily benefit their constituents directly.
And it's a scary thing because you're making that long-term commitment and you're hoping to save money through efficiencies because one bus is cheaper than 20 cars. But once you're there, if it doesn't work out well, if that relationship doesn't work, where are you going to get the money to leave? So yeah, it can be very scary.
What's the answer?
Ron had a point that is
So I think we're getting close on time.
Okay.
But I do want to circle back, take this gentleman's question, Chuck, and circle back on the actual improvements in the IAAs. I think that's something that's sort of dangling out there.
Yeah.
Maybe we can touch on before we close.
Why don't Tom, why don't
Yeah.
you just describe, and we'll take your question, sir.
Big problem with interagency agreements is just the number of people that have to sign off on them, whether you've got it, we call it interagency going in or an interagency going out. Interagency going out is like a contract for your agency, so it goes through the procurement office. The ones coming in, you have to establish the fund authority, so you've got to go through your budget execution system, post the money, have it in the system. It takes all kinds of signatures, some 4 to 6 signatures or sets of initials on each form from each agency. A problem that we've had in the past is that each agency has its own form. There's no standardization. So over the past year, there's been a government-wide effort to standardize the form, and agencies are increasingly signing up. Education's going to do it in 2015. Other agencies have started. It's Treasury and OPM, and I forget who the other agencies are, but people are willing, from federal agencies, are willing to join in on the conference call, I'm told, every couple weeks. Again, just saving some time on how many signatures, how many people are signing, could improve things. It's not going to get your statement of work done better. It's not going to resolve some political issues that the guy in the previous session had. But it might expedite things just to have a standardized form. Believe it or not, again, every agency's got one with its little logo on the top and different names, and you're signing in a different place and things like that. So it will help to have that standardization.
But Tom, in the form, there are terms and conditions that are also agreed upon unilaterally, right? Or
It varies. I mean, it's interagency agreement form. There is a memorandum of understanding oftentimes that precedes the interagency agreement. The interagency agreement is the obligating document. It can then allow an agency to do an IPAC to get actual payment for that obligation. It's used for a number of different reasons, and you might want to look into that again if you're a federal agency. Again, just could cut off maybe a week or two, but out of a year, that's a lot of time.
Well, so there's three general parts to an interagency agreement, right? If you're using the standard FMS 7600 days, general terms and conditions, relatively straightforward. You've got about this much space to write some stuff in there. And most of the time you see another document. 7600B, which is the funding strips and the amount of money, and that's where you're kind of haggling over prices. And then the third part is the service description, which can be pretty exhaustive. That's going to describe the service that's going to be provided. In our experience, in Treasury experience, I think that's where you get most of the hang-up. Not too many people get hung up on the actual 7600 form itself, although we have heard a couple of examples. But what we just heard with Working Capital Fund out of Treasury and Treasury's Franchise Fund, ARC, is once you get to the point where, and routinization is now my word of the day, once you get into a routine of this is what we do on an annual basis, you start to work through some of the, as you're getting out of the cars and climbing onto the bus is when people trip and fall. But once you get onto the bus, ideally, it's a little more smooth from that point.
All right, we have one last question from the gentleman in the back. Okay.
I used to work at Treasury Department a while ago, and faced, I was in an IT group, and we faced the challenges you're talking about, where we couldn't get enough capital to do the investments we needed to do. Our CFO went to Congress, and we got working capital fund authority that we could dump up to $3 million at the end of the year, and let that be like a piggy bank that could then be reinvested and held for long-term investments. So one strategy could be have the shared service providers have a little bit of a working capital fund on the side, because I think going to the Hills, I think can be really difficult, because they're looking to save money, not spend more on this. But when an agency has extra funding at the tail end of the fiscal year, which everybody always does, especially the larger agencies, they could funnel that into a working capital fund to keep their financial system and services up to par. So that's a strategy that could be explored. That might be a little bit different than what's been done, and there's history of having done that with treasuries.
Yeah, and USDA has that authority within USDA for USDA. It's not written in the law that we can do that out external to USDA, except for that one specific 4% retained.
The laws can be changed.
So essentially, you just ask your working capital fund to put up the money for your transfer, for your program, right?
You'd ask the clients. You'd ask the clients to contribute into your working capital.
Oh, I see.
Such that you could then, save for a rainy day, when eventually in 15 years, when you got 10 years or 5 years, whenever you got to do your next version of your TOTS product, you can have the funding.
I see.
It's an idea.
Okay. Well, that's all we have time for, folks. Thanks for being great participants, and good luck with the rest of the conference. Thanks.